Good people, welcome to the latest episode of Jonathan Thinks. I am your host, Jonathan Collins, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar. I've got a few things on my mind, and maybe, just maybe, you've been thinking about it too. First thing on my mind is this Louisiana racial gerrymandering ruling. So if you've been following the news, you've heard about this, but I want to recap, and not only recap, but I want to dive into it a little bit because this is, of course, very interesting, but it's incredibly important. So, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in the Louisiana racial gerrymandering case. In Louisiana v. Calais, the court held that Louisiana's second majority Black congressional district was an unconstitutional racial gerrymander, saying that the Voting Rights Act did not require the state to draw it in a way that creates for a Black district. What makes this really important is because this makes it significantly harder to use the Voting Rights Act to protect Black representation. So there are a few things that we need to unpack here. First, what is gerrymandering? Gerrymandering is essentially this very legal process where states can get together and they basically draw the congressional lines. So we all have a member of the United States House of Representatives who represents us, right? But the way we get those congressional districts that establish who represents us in Congress or who can run to represent us in Congress through the House is very different. So you'll notice that your congressional line boundaries, they don't align with your city boundaries. So it's not just like, well, I live in New York City, and so there's the Congress person representing New York City. Nope, doesn't work like that. We have several members of Congress representing folks who live in different parts of New York City, because the most important thing is that everybody has to have equal representation. So they draw the congressional lines not based off of city boundaries or community boundaries or anything like that. They draw it based off of population. And they have to draw and divide the congressional districts so that every person in the U.S. has the same level or degree of representation as one another, regardless of if you live in highly populated New York City or a small town in Iowa. Now, again, how do they draw these congressional lines? Every 10 years after the census comes out, states and members of Congress can come together and actually draw or redraw the lines based off of updated information about the population. And again, as long as every district has the same number of people, it makes it legal. What has happened is essentially the people in power have used this as an opportunity to draw district lines that essentially allow them to stay in power. So you have, Republicans and Democrats who come together and say, okay, this is going to be a Democratic district. This is going to be a Republican district. These people are going to favor me politically, and these people are going to oppose. There's nothing new about this. Do we like gerrymandering? There's a different discussion. One of the things about gerrymandering, though, that makes it so important, especially for racial politics, is that the main way that we've been able to keep Black representation or Black congressional districts or U.S. House districts is through gerrymandering, is through looking at these heavily Black populated cities like a Memphis, Tennessee, and saying, I'm going to draw a circle around this city, and this is going to be this major congressional district, and we are going to ensure that there is consistent Black representation in these districts. Now, again, you may have questions as to whether or not you think this is good or bad. What I will say is this: Black Americans make up about 12.5% of the U.S. population. In this gerrymandering system, Black Americans in Congress make up about 12% of Congress. So we actually have pretty much perfect descriptive representation right now as a function of this system that allows for these lines to be drawn. That ruling that just happened recently in Louisiana has now basically put that all in jeopardy. And you're already starting to see states, Tennessee, Alabama, South Carolina, Florida, all suddenly calling for the redrawing of the congressional districts to try to redraw and remove Black congressional districts. And of course, you're going to see this happen in particular in the South. Why in the South? Because the one consistent stronghold for the Democratic Party in the South has been Black representation. If you look at how Democratic politics in the South has operated over the course of the last 20, 25 years, it's just gotten redder and redder and redder. Republicans have amassed more and more and more power in the South. The only impenetrable force for the Democratic Party has been these Black congressional districts. Well, now the Supreme Court has essentially taken that idea and shot it in the trash can. So what we're going to see over time is the redrawing of districts, especially in the South, and we're going to see fewer and fewer Black folks in Congress, especially specifically though in the South. If you're in the Northeast, like where I am, if you're on the West Coast, it's different. Places where the Democratic Party is in power, you're not going to see this kind of attempt to draw out Black congressional power. Why? Because Black congressional power has been a main feature of Democratic Party politics. Democrats benefit from the power of Black representation. For Republicans, it's become an immense threat. And with the Supreme Court case, they are now using their ability to eliminate that threat. So if you're concerned, you should be. But I do have one silver lining for you. The whole idea of eliminating Black representation in the South hinges on the idea that when you redraw these district lines, and now there's suddenly no longer these pockets of voters that are majority Black. Now you're taking all the Black voters and now you're slicing them and you're splitting them into multiple districts. And now Black voters become the minority in multiple districts as opposed to being the majority in one single district. And you're banking on that being something that actually eliminates Black political representation. But I did a little digging, right? And for this to work, remember, it would assume that in these new districts where Black people are no longer the majority, that white voters, I would assume, especially white voters motivated by racial resentment, would be the primary ones who would ensure that there would be no Black political power in these new gerrymandered districts. Well, guess what? Again, you know I love a graph. I looked at racial resentment over time by region, and I found that one, that there actually were no differences in racial resentment by region up until basically Obama becomes president. Once Obama gets elected in 2008, we start to see regional differences in racial resentment. In particular, we start to see folks in the South and in the Midwest showing slightly higher levels of racial resentment than folks in the West and the Northeast. But that continues to worsen as Trump emerges in 2016, and that gap has been pretty consistent ever since. But it gets deeper, and this is where you can find the potential optimism. Because yes, you are seeing higher levels of racial resentment in the South and in the Midwest. And it is the Midwest where, Trump was able to win critical swing states during the 2024 election that ultimately carried him to victory. So that racial resentment flame that he fueled, it worked. But when it comes to this racial gerrymandering issue, I did some digging and I looked at racial resentment over time and propensity to vote in a congressional election, in a House election, a U.S. House of Representatives election. And I find significantly lower levels of racial resentment from folks who intend to vote in U.S. House of Representatives elections. And that trend is consistent even when I break down by region. So guess what? These white voters in the South who you are depending on to now eliminate Black representation as these new congressional district lines are being drawn, guess what? It might not work the way you think it's going to work. It might not be that simple because the people who live in these areas that you are drawing these new districts around, guess what? They might not be as racist as you think. They actually might be the folks that see what's happening, and they might be more motivated and more activated to ensure that we do have Black representation and more progressive representation at the congressional level. So in the totality of it, this is a dark day. This is a major blow to the Voting Rights Act, especially Section 2. This is a major concern for the prospect of Black representation, especially in the immediate moment. But if you look at the data, you can find some optimism here, and don't be surprised, and spin back on me if I'm wrong. But don't be surprised if there's actually a reverse effect where we end up seeing more Black representation than less in the long run on the pathway to actually restoring and strengthening Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That's just me finding some potential optimism in the data, but I feel pretty good about this. So we'll see. All I'm saying is all hope is not lost, right? The best way through this is to get out, to vote, and to really show the U.S. Supreme Court and the President of the United States that Black representation is one of the important cornerstones of modern American democracy. And I believe we'll show them that. The second thing I've been thinking about is the assassination attempt on Donald Trump. As we know by now, there was a shooting at the White House Correspondents' Dinner that took place at the end of April. This was supposed to be one of Washington's most staged and ceremonial nights, but then suddenly it turned into a real confrontation with political violence. Federal prosecutors say Cole Thomas Allen came into the Washington Hilton armed, bypassed security checkpoints, and opened fire while President Trump was inside the building. Now, he did not actually get into the ballroom where the dinner was taking place and where President Trump was sitting. But he did get through or to a security checkpoint, and folks inside the building could hear gunshots. It was a terrifying moment, and it was clear, although not conclusive, but pretty clear, that Thomas Allen Cole had the intentions of assassinating the President of the United States. And I think this is an important story for multiple reasons. The first reason, I think, is a very simple one, which is the importance of protocol. And look, being the President of the United States is a very challenging job. It's a very difficult job. It's also a job that requires a devout attention to protocol. The President has Secret Service for a reason. And look, I'm speculating here, but everything that we've heard about Donald Trump and how he operates the presidency is that, not a dude that is submissive to a lot of the protocol that they tend to put in place to protect the president. It's a dude that kind of does what he wants. This is the president that decided, I want to sleep in my own house. I don't want to sleep at the White House. This is a president that does weird, bizarre things like, I want to DoorDash filet of fish sandwiches from McDonald's to the White House. These things are funny on the surface, but they're dangerous in a technical sense because they have safety protocol around the White House for a reason. There are certain things that you can't do. I've been reading Barack Obama's recent book, and he talks about how, one of the things that made the presidency so challenging for him is that he had to give up all of these, freedoms and liberties that he was used to just as a regular person. Like, he couldn't just go for a walk. He couldn't step outside and smoke a cigarette. They're just normal, everyday people things. He could never be alone. He could never be by himself. There was always Secret Service watching. That's a part of the program, man. That's the protocol. And when you have a president who thinks that he's above reading the security briefings, that wants to make decisions, personal decisions, that seem like they would at the very least be incongruent with the expectations for presidents when Secret Service's job is to keep you safe. Hey, man, you don't need a random DoorDasher showing up at the White House. What are we doing? So there are things like this that show us that Trump has been willing to just speed bump over procedure and protocol that they have put in place to keep the president safe. And then things happen like this, because it's not just that Trump was the target of an assassination attempt. This is the third assassination attempt on Donald Trump since he entered the political limelight. This is not normal. We don't see presidents facing regular assassination attempts, especially at the level where it becomes national news. Sure, I'm sure that there are a lot of plots on the lives of presidents, things that are detail behind security briefings that are top secret that the public doesn't have access to. But dog, we've seen footage of people running up on you, and this is crazy. So on one end, it's just, I gotta wonder if this dude has any respect for protocol, and if he doesn't, he really needs to start doing so immediately, because it's placing his life in immediate danger. The other thing that I want to talk about, though, with respect to the Trump assassination attempt, is the only close analog I could find to this was Ronald Reagan. And so there was an assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan on March 30th, 1981. And you want to know where that assassination attempt took place? The very same building, the Washington Hilton. John Hinckley Jr. runs up on Ronald Reagan, shoots him basically right in the chest. Reagan was seriously wounded. He did recover. He did survive. And look, it turned out that John Hinckley's motivation seemed to have nothing to do with Reagan's politics. Apparently, it was a guy who had this deranged obsession with Jodie Foster, and he wanted to get her attention. And he thought the way that I'll get her to, the way I'll riz her up is like I'll try to kill the president. So again, the assassination attempt had really nothing to do with Reagan's policies. But then you look at Reagan's policies, and again, not related, but Ronald Reagan was the president who really introduced a policy agenda of color blindness, of not just small government, but he really ushered in this era where he activated a lot of white racial conservatism and white identity, and pointing to this idea that we should be moving past race, that race doesn't matter, that race shouldn't be featured. And Donald Trump has essentially been taking the Reagan playbook and is giving it steroids. And while Ronald Reagan was blowing a dog whistle, Donald Trump has a megaphone. Donald Trump has made anti-DEI one of the primary features of his presidential agenda. He's getting a lot of flack for initiating war on Iran. The first war that he initiated was the culture war here in the United States of America. We are this close to having a racial divide not seen in this country since the Civil War. That's where we are. And so, the thing about this assassination attempt, this most recent assassination attempt on Trump, and this is why I draw this parallel, is that he's becoming Ronald Reagan on steroids, and not in a good way. Ronald Reagan was a president that didn't say the quiet part out loud. Donald Trump is screaming it. And look, I don't agree with political violence as a response to this, but you have an alleged shooter who is calling himself the friendly federal assassin, writing notes and leaving emails to friends and family saying, look, I apologize for what I'm about to do, but I feel like I have to do this because of how I feel about this person's policies. Yeah. Don't condone the violence. The result should never be political violence. The result should be, the response should always be political mobilization. If you don't like the president, don't shoot the president. Vote the president out of office. Vote the members of Congress who support the president's agenda out of office. You take your action to the ballot box, not to the bullet box, right? Simple as that. But that anger, that frustration, that animosity, this assassination attempt is showing us that the feelings are real. That folks in this country are looking at all of these anti-DEI policies, looking at this culture war, looking at this racial division. And black folks in particular are saying, we are worse off, significantly worse off than we were before. And this has to stop. So I hope Donald Trump gets the peaceful message. I hope he starts to finally listen to the folks who are taking peaceful, respectful, and civil approaches to express their political discontent with his policies and his agenda. Because what I don't want for him or for any president is for political violence to start to become the norm. Because I'll put it to you this way: who wants to sign up for the job when you keep seeing people get shot and killed by doing that job? Not me. And if nobody now wants to be president, if nobody wants to lead, where do we find ourselves as a country? So I hope this is a wake-up call to Donald Trump and his policies. I hope this is a wake-up call too to Donald Trump and his consistent attack on the integrity of elections, because that's not helping either. Because people are getting mad, man. People are pissed off. So you better listen to them while all they're doing is talking. Because people are hurting, man. People are really hurting out here. Speaking of pain, that gets me to my last thing that I'm thinking about. And that is the breakup between Klay Thompson and Meg Thee Stallion. And less about the breakup itself and just kind of the tabloid aspects of it. But what I'm really thinking about is what's happened as a response to it, and really all the dialogue that is happening around the Black manosphere. So, long story short, Houston rapper Meg Thee Stallion confirmed that she ended the relationship with Klay Thompson. And basically she said, quote, trust, fidelity, and respect are non-negotiables. And then the breakup, it quickly spread all over the internet. And really, it turned into gender wars. And so, in particular, it created a very polarized conversation. And it was clear that the lines were drawn between Black men and Black women on this, where I think, where Black women were coming to the aid of Megan from the standpoint of feeling like that she's vindicated and moving on from someone who was unfaithful to her, and Black men who use this as a moment to really sort of verbally punch at Meg Thee Stallion and, justifying the idea of Klay Thompson engaging in infidelity because of who he is. He's a 4-time NBA champion. He's an former NBA All-Star. He's made, $200 million in his NBA career. He's a rich He's a rich, handsome athlete. What do you expect? Of course, he's going to do what he's going to do, right? And justifying it. And Meg should have known better. She should have expected this. She should have saw this coming. Why did she expect any kind of different outcome? And my issue is just the formulation, though, of this whole idea of the Black manosphere. Not the issue, not the Black manosphere forming itself, but what it's becoming. So what do I mean by Black manosphere? I'm really talking about a large public digital community where Black men talk about issues from the perspective of being Black men. And sometimes, usually it's Black men talking to Black men, but it's also Black men just talking about largely the experience of being Black men. And I don't want to tear down the idea of the Black manosphere totally, because I do think it's important for us as Black men to have spaces where we can talk about our perspectives. So many of us go through our daily lives and, we are the only one, or maybe one of few, in our workplaces or sometimes in our communities on a day-to-day basis. And it gets lonely and it gets isolated. And so just having a public and digital community of brothers who you can, talk to and be open with about the experiences that we deal with as Black men, some of the challenges, some of the ways in which we get misunderstood, some of the things that we have to, try to cope with, and the kind of the ways which we have to sometimes on the spot regulate our emotions in environments where we're constantly gaslit and triggered, and where subtle things can tap into a lot of the traumas that we experience just through our lives and all the things that we've seen. And so having a space, again, I think is really important. The problem is, this can't be a space that's built on tearing down Black women. And I fear that that's what's happening. And so you have these spaces of Black masculinity talk, Joe Budden podcast, Breakfast Club, insert others, places where Black men talk about the experiences of being Black men. But why does it seem like at some point, whenever these situations happen with Black women, especially when Black women are talking about the harm that they face from Black men, we kind of just tell them to shut up and stay quiet, we're justifying and trying to find the reason why the Black man might have enacted harm, or discredit the Black women who are saying that they're being harmed. And I'm telling you, brothers, you don't want your space to be that. We don't want our communities to be that. We don't want Black male community and Black male public spaces and dialogue spaces to only exist to tear down Black women. And why do I feel like that's the case? I feel like this is the case because there's all this conversation about Meg Thee Stallion and talking about how dumb she was and how she should have known better and what does she expect, and guys making comments about her sexual history. And there's all this critique of Meg Thee Stallion. None of y'all had nothing to say about Rickea Jackson. For folks who don't know, Rickea Jackson is a WNBA player, plays for the Los Angeles Sparks. She was dating an NFL player, guy for the Atlanta Falcons. They were in a domestic relationship. The football player ends up being arrested for domestic violence. He tried to run her over with his car. And it was crickets about James Pierce Jr., the boyfriend, the NFL player, right? There's been too many times where the abuse of Black women has been obvious and the Black manosphere has been quiet, or just not loud enough, to me, in my opinion. Because like I said, Rickea Jackson, Ray Rice. And the biggest one to me is all these guys who are defending Diddy. Okay, P. Diddy is now serving time for sex trafficking. And it was a RICO case. And if you follow the case closely, yes. Was there very strong evidence that he was engaged in sex trafficking? He wasn't sex trafficking. He was just freaky. I'm here to tell you, I don't care. I don't care what the charges are. The moment I saw that video of him smacking the out of Cassie, that's all I needed to see. I don't care what the charges are. Something needed to happen to him because that was absurd. That was absurd. You can't, there's no defense for that. There's no defense for a man to just smack the dog out of a woman and then drag her back to the hotel room. But there's been all this defense. And again, I love the fact that there are spaces where we can talk about being Black men, how we can talk about ways to help ourselves financially, to build together, to grow together, ways we can talk about being better fathers, better men, ways we can talk about, again, some of the hardships and things that we experience, the obstacles, the barriers that get in our way. There are systems in place to make life significantly more challenging for us. And I'm glad that we can have places to come and be in solidarity around addressing those issues and inspiring one another to move past some of those barriers. But we can't protect and make excuses for those of us who are just straight outright harming and dogging Black women. We can't do that. We can't do that. So, and I'm not saying this from a place of moral righteousness. I'm saying it from a standpoint of the only way to even keep the legitimacy of this is for it to be a space that doesn't do that. Because here's the thing, Black men, we can be critiqued as well. The same way we have critiques about a Black woman with an extensive sexual history. It's the same way we can have critiques of Black men who are not involved in their child's life. Well, but there's reasons for that, right? There are systemic reasons for that, right? We can talk about Black men struggling to find jobs and job opportunities. Oh, there's reasons for that, right? There are systemic reasons for that, right? There are barriers in the place of that, right? We can talk about Black men not owning intellectual property, not owning businesses, not being entrepreneurs. Oh, there are reasons for that, right? There are barriers in front of that, right? The same answer holds true for Black women. There are reasons. There are barriers. There's systems that prevent them. Look, I don't love the way Meg Thee Stallion handled the situation. Just personally, just because I don't think broadcasting things over the internet like that is the way to go. I would have rather her handle it just like internally and in privately. But she clearly felt hurt and she clearly felt embarrassed. And she wanted Klay Thompson, I think, to feel that same pain or to feel some level of pain and some level of embarrassment. I'm not here to police her emotions, and we shouldn't be policing her emotions. What we should be doing as Black men is having the same level of thought and care and understanding for the conditions that lead to a Black woman to make such a public reaction. We should be given the same grace and the same justification that we give to a dude who smacks out of his girlfriend on camera and drags her to a hotel room. At the very least, we should be doing. So look, I'm glad there's an online community. I want those communities to persist. But if those communities are just turning Black women into punching bags, I'm telling you, there's only a matter of time before this all comes crashing down. But that's what I think. Let me know what you think. Hit the comments on YouTube. Hit me up on social media. Let me know what you think about racial gerrymandering and the prospects of Black representation. Do you have any kind of optimism in the way that I do about maybe there could be a positive backlash here? Let me know what you think about that. Let me know what you think about this Trump assassination attempt. Let me know what you think about Black manosphere, the Meg Thee Stallion, Klay Thompson situation. I think all these conversations are so important in different ways, but equally important because what's going on right now is just crazy. So I'm just glad that we have these spaces again where we can have this type of dialogue. And with that, concludes the latest episode of Jonathan Thinks. Again, I am your host, Jonathan Collins, your friendly neighborhood democracy scholar. Remember that every time we convene, it's an opportunity to grow. We do it with love, we do it with joy, and we do it together. These are a few of my thoughts, and who knows, maybe, just maybe, you're thinking about it too. Until next time, peace.